In Numbers chapter 13, we read of a story where the Israelites are about ready to enter into the promised land that God gave them. And in that, Michael, I don't think I'm being able to advance. But in this, as they stand at the edge of entering into the land that flowed with milk and honey, they realized that they needed to, first of all, send out spies. So Moses sent out 12 spies. We perhaps all remember the story. The 12 spies went and were gone for many days, and they came back with the bounty that they found in this promised land. Truly, it was a land of flowing with milk and honey. And yet, 10 of the spies said that there is danger in that land. And beginning with verse 31 in Numbers 13, we read, "But the men who had gone up with him said, 'We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we.' And they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, 'The land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants.'" Are you getting the picture here? "And all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. There we saw the giants, the descendants of Anak, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight." Now Caleb had just said, hey, we can go in and we can take the land that God has given us. But these other 10 spies gave a different picture. And their picture was, yes, though God had brought us through all these trials and tribulations, that we had gone through the 10 plagues that allowed us to be freed from the Egyptian bondage, that we were guided and guarded by the fire, the pillar of fire at night and the pillar of cloud during the day that led us. And though when we came against the boundaries of the Red Sea, it parted and we walked on dry land. And then we saw the waters close as Pharaoh and his chariots came after us. Despite all that, they were disillusioned by what laid before them. And therefore, that influence made them to say, I cannot take the final leap that we need to take. To the children of Israel, it was just that. A huge leap of faith to believe that they could conquer the land of Canaan with giants occupying it, despite all that they had gone through with the Lord leading them and helping them and providing for them. The children of Israel were afraid to take that leap of faith that would take them to the promised land. But their misunderstanding was this: God was not asking for a leap of faith. He was asking for a step of faith. We were looking forward to putting 2020 behind us, but we found out that turning the page on the calendar does not keep the problems from 2020 carrying over into 2021. We have witnessed the economic collapse of certain businesses like restaurants and movie theaters and such due to being shut down by the local and state authorities. We have changed the way we go about our day-to-day business in how we socialize, how we shop, how we entertain, how we are educated, and even how we worship our God. Challenges have been many for us to face. We have seen the devastating results of COVID as people lost their jobs, had to shelter in place, and more tragically, lost their lives, including those who are connected to or part of our extended family here at Oak Hill. Under these conditions, it is easy to feel despair and to even feel some anger. It becomes hard sometimes for us to remain hopeful under these conditions. We're told to hold on, that we must take that leap of faith to remain true. But for some, it is difficult enough just to maintain our faith, much less take that leap. Has your faith been tried lately? Leaps are huge, But again, I am here to tell you that God is not asking for a leap. Most oftentimes, he is asking for something much smaller on our part than a leap. He is wanting only for a step of faith, and thus is our lesson today. So we realize that God expects this step of faith within us, because sometimes the leap can be frightening. To show what a step can do for mankind, think about a step on a ladder. A person stepping down from a ladder, quite insignificant, is it not? But on July 20th, 1969, a man stepped down from the ladder, and it made the difference as 1 billion people watched that step. Neil Armstrong, coming down the ladder of the Eagle landing module, he took that one step and said this: "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." As he placed his foot for the first time, a human being standing on the surface of the moon. Think about the many steps that led up to that final small step. All the work that went in to help them to travel the 240,000 miles to the moon. And yet it came down to one final small step for all of mankind. In thinking about that small step, we look at Matthew chapter 14. This is the story where the apostles are in a boat. The wind begins to blow. Jesus is not there. And all of a sudden, out on the water, they see someone coming. Someone that's seemingly floating across the water. But that person wasn't floating. They were walking. They thought it was a ghost. But in verse 27, it says that Jesus spoke to them saying, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid." And it was Peter who answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Peter's first step on water gave hope to all of us today that with Jesus Christ, we can accomplish anything. We often tell this story about Peter, that Peter became fearful and sank. That's what we emphasize a lot. But I think we miss the point sometimes when we do that. We need to admit that Peter had to have the faith to take that first step out of that boat onto the water. Did any other apostle demonstrate such faith? He actually walked on the water with the Lord. Sure, he would later become fearful and sink, but because he had taken that first step out, who was there to pull him back up? It was the Lord. Do you always seek to succeed in your first efforts? The second point is that there's a failure to take the step of faith can affect us more than we can imagine. What if when the Israelites listened to the 10 spies who said that they could not conquer the people of the Canaanites, and then Moses in turn just decided, "I give up. I've gone through all this with you and I'm done." And then decided not to do any more, not to take a further step. You remember what the Lord did in Numbers chapter 14? He told Moses, "I'm tired of these people, and I will send a pestilence on them for their lack of taking that final step into the land of Canaan. And I will build a new nation through you, Moses." If another step had not been taken, the Israelite nation would have been wiped out at that time, except through Moses. But Moses took the step further, took that one step in that he went before the Lord and pleaded to him, Lord, do not do this. And God listened, and he pulled back on what he was to do. The punishment was that these people alive would not enter into the promised land, but their descendants would be able to do so. Not even Moses would be able to enter, but Caleb and the other spy who was positive about taking that step into the promised land, they were allowed to do so. It is so important as that we look at that. Peter, and sometimes when we look at that, what that step of faith can do, going back to that story of Peter walking on the water, what would have happened if Peter had not taken that step? Well, you're probably saying, well, he wouldn't have sunk in the water, would he? I see it different because I do not see his walk as a total failure. The fact that he did walk on water, it may have been a short walk, but it's more than I have done, and I'm sure it's probably more than you have done. Peter could sometimes be a little too self-assured of himself, could he not? And I'm wondering if this point in his life that he sought to be a little humbled by this event. I think that it may have helped him learn a lesson. Speaking about doing something is one thing, actually doing it is quite another. Peter taking the step and falling makes me not be as hard on myself during these difficult times, for sometimes perhaps doubting. Many of us have had our faith tried during this pandemic. Let me ask, what has already changed in your life because you failed to simply take that one step of faith? Or what direction has your life taken since you did take that step of faith? One step leads to another, and then another, and another. These steps can have tremendous impact on our lives and that of others. I will tell a story to illustrate this that perhaps many of you have heard in the past, but it is a good illustration. An old, poor Scottish farmer was out in his field one day trying to make a living, and he heard a cry coming from a nearby bog. He ran to that bog, and there was a young lad who was covered waist deep in the muck and mire of that bog. He was terrified, screaming and struggling, trying to free himself. Farmer Fleming stepped forward and saved that lad from what could have been a slow and terrifying death. The next day, a fancy carriage pulls up to the Scotsman's sparse dwelling. An eloquently dressed nobleman comes out of the carriage, and he introduces himself as the father of the young lad that Farmer Fleming had saved. And he said, I want to repay you for the great deed that you've done. But Farmer Fleming said, no pay at all. No pay. I was happy to be able to save the child. I cannot accept payment for what I did. At that same moment, the son of the farmer came out of the dwelling. And the nobleman said, is that your son? And he said, yes. He said, well, would you let me do this? Let me take your son and let me make sure that he has a good education. If that lad is anything like you, he will grow up to be a great man. Farmer Fleming agreed. In time, Fleming's son graduated from St. Mary's Hospital Medical School in London, England, and went on to become known throughout the world as the noted Sir Alexander Fleming, the discoverer of penicillin. Years afterward, the nobleman's son was stricken with pneumonia. He needed saving yet again. What saved him? penicillin. The nobleman's name who came out in the carriage, well, his name was Randolph Churchill. His son's name, Sir Winston Churchill. Think what would have become of England during World War II if it did not have the leadership of Churchill. Steps lead to giant leaps. Think about it. If Christ had not taken the step to the cross, we would have no pathway to heaven. Third, when we break things down into the steps of the task, then the task itself is not so overwhelming. For God, nothing is insignificant. Jesus tells us that a cup of water will not go unrewarded in Matthew chapter 10, verse 42. Think about it. It was during when the children of Israel were up against the city of Jericho, the walls of Jericho. That truly was a daunting task to think that they could break down those walls. However, to break those walls down took a simple first step as they obeyed the Lord and began marching around the city. And we know that on the seventh day, by taking one step at a time, the walls of Jericho fell. You know, in this life, sometimes things can be a little overwhelming. A couple marries, not much debt at this time and not much to look after. However, years pass by. A house is bought, perhaps 2 cars, kids, school, jobs, and so forth. And they simply wonder, how can they do it all? It is best to look at each challenge as small steps. You can take one step, but each step will add up, just like each step added up when the children of Israel marched around Jericho and the walls fell. But whenever you are faced with an insurmountable problem, before you give up, remember what the Lord has promised you. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, we are told we will never be tempted more than which we are able to bear. The burden will never be too great that we cannot find a way to carry the load. The Lord promised, I am with you always, even until the end of the world. And in Hebrews, if the Lord is with us, who can be against us? It's probably 14 or 15 years ago, I preached a lesson and I used the story of the farmer's mule. And I think this would be a good illustration to use in just showing how important it is to take small steps, to not let failure to take hold all the time. One day on this farm, back before we had all the mechanized machinery that we had today, an old mule of a farmer's fell into an abandoned well that was dry. The animal cried out piteously for hours as the farmer tried to figure out, what do I do? How do I get this animal out of this well? Finally, he decided it was futile. The mule was old and near the end of its life, and the well needed to be covered up so nothing fell into this well again. So he invited all his neighbors to come and help him with the task that had to be at hand. What was that task? Everybody grabbed a shovel and they began shoveling in dirt. They were going to fill up that well and bury the mule alive. When the first shovels of dirt began to fall into the well, the mule at first cried out and wailed horribly. Then, after a few shovelfuls later, the mule quieted down. The farmer looked over into the well and was amazed by what he saw. As the dirt was placed in shovel by shovel, it would hit the back of the mule. The mule would shake off the dirt and it would fall to the ground beneath it, and the mule would step up. And the people that were helping the farmer became all more vigorous in their efforts, and they shoveled even faster. And as the dirt fell, it continued to fall on the back of the mule, and he would continue to shake it up. He continued to step up. And step by step, he continued until he stepped out of the well. Life shovels dirt on us sometimes, all kinds of dirt. The trick to getting out of the well is not to let it bury you, but to shake it off and take a step up. Each of our troubles is yet a stepping stone. We can get out of the deepest wells just by not stopping, never giving up. Shake it off, take a step up. Fourthly, do not let failure stand in the way of taking your first step. Peter denied Christ in Matthew chapter 26. This is after all the miracles that he had seen Jesus performed, and even after he had walked on the water and Jesus had saved him from this. Even after affirming in Matthew 16:16 that Jesus was the Christ, he still denied him during this time of trouble and torment. His faith was shaken yet again. After denying Christ, he could have said, "Listen, I'm a failure. Yet again, I have disappointed the Lord. Yet again, my faith has been tried and I failed." And he could have simply said, "That's it. I am no longer worthy." There is an old saying that goes this way: a man must prove himself over and over again to be considered himself a success, and yet need to fail only once to prove himself a failure. That's Satan talking. Peter could have given up, saying that he had let the Lord down just too many times, that he was not worthy of being part of the Lord's kingdom anymore. Think of the ramifications if Peter had let failure once again keep him down. And take that first step again for the Lord. But he picked himself up and he stepped forward on the day of Pentecost and preached the first gospel sermon where thousands were saved and the church was established. Friends, the true shame is not in failure and falling down. We've all experienced it in one form or another. The true shame comes when we fail to get back up and take that first step back to Christ. And lastly, the fifth item is, do not let the fear of failure stand in your way. In Matthew chapter 25, we read the story, the parable of the one-talent man. Talents were given to 3 individuals, 5, 2, and 1. Those other 2, the first 2, took those talents and made gain. But yet the one with 1 talent was so afraid of losing it that he would not take the first step to try to increase his master's wealth. So many times we think we simply don't have the right talents. We don't have enough skills. And so what the Lord has given us, we let atrophy. We do not take the step forward in coming through this. To grow means we must sometimes take a small step out of our comfort zone. We usually experience fear when we leave our comfort zone. Going to a dentist, speaking to a group, getting on a plane, planning a dinner for your soon-to-be in-laws, going to the funeral home to console a friend, all involve stepping out of our comfort zone. If we do not make the first step, then we can never get better. Remember the first step you took as a child? I would assume you probably failed. You fell. But if you had not taken it, you would have never learned to walk. And because you stumbled and fell, you didn't give up trying to walk. You kept at it till you succeeded. Because your parents were encouraging you to take that step yet again. It wasn't that you were being put down, but you were being raised up by your parents as they saw you trying to take the step. We can learn a lesson from it as those around us that are struggling and we see them fail. Instead of trying to push them down, we need to be helping lift them up and encouraging them. You know, I remember my very first sermon that I preached in the auditorium of the church. I was 15 years old. I'd gone through a training class. I had typed everything out on paper with my old typewriter that belonged to my older brother so that I at least could read it. And if I read it, just read it at a normal pace, it would take at least 20 minutes. It took only 10 because I was so nervous and reading so quickly, so fast, which is sometimes hard for a southern boy. But I remember sitting on that front pew waiting for that last song to get over, that I would have to get up and preach for the first time before the congregation. Again, I'd already taken a step in the young men's training class and had that encouragement, but this was different. And I remember saying a prayer before that song ended. And the prayer was simply this, and some of you heard this before. Lord, please, when I get up and start walking to the pulpit, please let me fall down and break my leg. I was that scared, that nervous. I am confident that speaking in the young men's training class helped me at least sit on that front pew. And if the good Lord had answered my prayer in the way that I had wanted, I wouldn't even finish my step and would never have been able to get up there. But the good Lord was there. I was sinking in the water, and the Lord pulled me up out. A shy, introverted kid was able to speak. And as you know, as my wife will tell you, I can't shut up now. But it happened a step at a time, and it can happen for you as well. Abraham took the first step into the unknown land. Moses took the first step in leading the Israelites out of Egypt. Paul took the first step to Damascus to be saved. Paul said, when people say, I am not worthy, Paul himself said he was chiefest of sinners, and yet the Lord deemed him worthy. In conclusion, when you think about all the things that involved, and as you see in the picture of the slide, leaps can be scary. When Jesus took that first step out of the upper room, he knew he was headed to betrayal, mockery, torture, and death. But the price mankind would have to pay would be far worse if he didn't. So he took it. He took that first step for us. One small step for a man. One giant leap for a mankind. The gap that existed between man and God was needed a huge leap. Christ came down and built the bridge so that no longer must we take this huge leap, but we can take a step of faith one at a time and meet the Lord. Jesus is the bridge over our next leap. All we have to do is to step over it, simply, one step at a time, a step of faith. Thank you for listening.